Good morning, everybody. I'm Ian,
Hey, I'm Paul.
and we have a guest on Surviving Central City podcast this time. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, Ben Kaufman, Deputy Chief of a mid-sized fire department in Northwest Virginia.
Excellent. So it has been a year and a half, I think, since we've done one of these podcasts.
It's like,
Hey,
oh my God, we're back.
yeah, I know. To absolutely no demand, we're back anyway.
There were two. I'll give credit to two people that wanted us back.
Yeah, I've gotten yeah, we both know one person who asks every time she talks to us what the
Yes.
next podcast
Yes.
is. But I've gotten a lot of questions like, "You still doing this? Can I take it off of my podcast feed? Are you going to do another one?" So yeah, so we're back. One of the things one of the things we talked about last time was starting to dip into the interviews and talking to people around the industry that we may know or maybe even don't know.
Yep.
And Ben is an interesting one. I'm going to ask him a question in a moment about his history, but Ben is an interesting one because we've talked previously about public safety's relation to emergency management. And Ben's interesting because he went from a uniformed firefighter directly into emergency management for another jurisdiction. So a lot of kind of diving in head first, I guess I would say,
Yep.
and
Yep.
drinking through a fire hose as far as catching up. So some of the questions we have are about, what did you know and when did you know it, or what are the things you wish you would have known stepping into it, etc. So if you would, Ben, first give us a little bit about your entire work history because there's some interesting stuff there. If you don't point out some stuff that I already know, I'm going to point it out. But tell us about your work history and then how you ended up doing emergency management. Lifelong dream, accident, what?
Yeah, of course, lifelong dream. No, so I started out as a young volunteer. My uncle joined a volunteer fire department in our hometown and got super involved. And so when I was around 12, I started hanging out at the firehouse. You could join as a junior at 14. So I did join as a junior, and that was May of 1990. So I've been going ever since. And then basically went through all the volunteer time as a teenager and stuff, thinking I was going to make it a career. Had a desired a career change before I even started in it, apparently, and I moved to Montana. Worked on a ranch out there for a while, which was awesome. But in Montana, even if you're working on a ranch, everybody is a firefighter. So we had, a pretty huge fire that burned through on neighboring property. Most ranchers maintain their own fire engine, like a little brush truck kind of thing with a pickup truck with a water tank and
Huh.
pump and hose. So and anytime there's a thunderstorm, the ranchers all go to high points around the ranch and you watch for lightning strikes because obviously that's the big thing is you have a lightning strike, it'll start a fire, even if it's the next
Right.
day. So I had no idea. So I'm on my little first thunderstorm in Montana with the rancher, and we're setting up on a high point, and I'm documenting on a notepad like, okay, hey, that hit this field over here, that ridge got a lightning strike, and then the next day you go and follow up because a lot of times you have a small smoke that's in there from the fire, but it rains enough that it keeps it down for that first night or first morning after the thunderstorm, and so you have to go follow up the next day to see if it's still smoldering and put it out. But we went to, as we were on the high point, we saw a huge fire burning about 30 miles away, and we went to another ranch, and I got back into firefighting. So it was like 6,000 acre fire. So even not being involved in the fire department, I was firefighting. So I moved
You just
back to
couldn't get away
Virginia.
from it.
Couldn't get away. Moved back to Virginia and said that's my career. So it's been going ever since. And I worked for a small department out in Western Virginia, Shenandoah Valley area, and really wanted to become a fire marshal. And so there was not a lot of opportunity there. And I took a class with a bunch of fire marshals from Fairfax County who told me there's 100 people in their fire marshal's office, lots of opportunities. So that's
Yeah.
where I went, and it was great. I worked a great career there, and worked in the fire stations. I worked in the fire marshal's office, which is really kind of where I first kind of got borderline EM. So when I was in the fire marshal's office, I started out doing inspections and stuff, no big deal. But then I became the explosives officer for Fairfax County. So they had one person in the fire marshal's office who was dedicated to regulating explosives, commercial blasting, quarry blasting, um, all the other potential explosive issues that you might encounter through a fire marshal's office. And there we started getting involved a lot in like emergency plans for different businesses. We started looking at different things from the federal government. There was a lot of blasting at Fort Belvoir, and we worked through their EOP. So I started understanding a little bit of minimal about like how to look at an EOP, what it is, how to understand emergency planning. We had a lot of meetings with emergency planners, and then at that time Dave McKernan was my
The great Dave
Yeah,
McKernan.
the Dave McKernan. So, yeah, he was my deputy chief, and we got involved in a lot of public information. Blasting itself, commercial blasting, has a lot of different, you know, public concerns. People worried about their house being damaged by blasting. Obviously, that's a huge issue. And then there was a large quarry in southern Fairfax County where they built, some homes really close to the quarry. And there was a lot of concern there about quarry blasting. So we ended up leading some public meetings, brought in a bunch of HOAs, and we would have stuff. And so I really started kind of understanding the tie between the fire department and citizen groups, which is something that you don't really see a lot from the fire department side. You kind of come, spray some water, and leave. So when you're getting into this more detailed stuff, that's a whole different experience. And then I moved out of there and moved into a couple other roles in the fire department, but my last role in Fairfax County was the emergency preparedness captain, working with one of the illustrious leaders here in our group. But yeah, so we had a great time there, and I really started to dive then into emergency management. And I guess maybe I need to back up a minute, because how I got to that position was through incident management team. So I got on our Type 3 Regional Incident Management Team, NCRINT, in 2017, and started that was a big dive into EM, as much as an IMT is in an EM, and just thinking about EOCs and how do they work, and writing emergency plans, and reading emergency plans. Like one of the early large scale exercises we did, was a Type 3 flooding event. Shouldn't have been a huge deal, but it turned into a huge deal. And one of the things we talked about was that, what would have been smart would have been to find the EOP for the jurisdiction that we were, simulating this flood in, and read their EOP, look at it and see if they have a flood plan. Maybe they have some of this stuff identified. And of course, from the fire department world, that's, again, a hard transition to think about, going back and look at somebody else's plans. We come in and we command and we spray water and go home, and thinking about, maybe somebody already planned this and I don't have to do that. It's not an easy. But the IMT has been really good, and I got immersed. We got embedded with public health during COVID, a couple of different health departments. I spent multiple months working with that. I spent a month deployed for civil unrest embedded in the police department. So it's given me an opportunity to look beyond simply, the fire truck kind of perspective, which has been really helpful. And then the emergency preparedness position in Fairfax was great. Early on, I had been in the position maybe just a week or two, trying to learn how things are going. And we got a call that from a very technical engineer that a pond, a dam, was about to overflow and break and flood a part of Fairfax County.
Yep.
So it turned into this multi-week immersion into EOC and Fairfax County EM and technical.
I remember that one. Yeah, I do remember that.
It's crazy. So the upshot was that there was a small pond that drained this huge kind of subdivision area, and a beaver had decided to move into this pond and plugged up the outflow. And so the pond now was at the very top of the dam, which the dam was like earthen dam. It was like 16 feet high or something. And so there was a huge amount of water. And then there was a containment area below it, but the containment area itself also had started, because the water was overflowing the dam. The beaver was, especially, even for a beaver, apparently super busy, and moved down and plugged up the outflow to that. So now that everything that could possibly drain water was plugged. And so if this dam was starting to fail, and it was starting to fail, starting to get, imminent threat of failure, then the water would have flooded across a major roadway and flooded a bunch of houses. So, of course, from the fire department side, I'm like, hey, no big deal. We'll send some swift water teams. We'll evacuate, all good. And it's like, but that's not quite how EM works things. And so many meetings later, I learned about, pulling in technical experts. And, one of the first things was they said, hey, we need to, we're in this meeting. We got engineers from Public Works. We got, soil and water conservation engineers, all the EM people, all kinds of people. There's probably, maybe 40 or 50 people in this meeting. And so, we need to drain the water out of this pond immediately. I'm like, no worries, dude. I'll send a couple fire trucks. We can pump 2,000 gallons of water a minute out of that thing. We'll have this thing drained in no time. They're like, whoa. The engineers are freaking out, because I said, this water, once the water gets into the earthen dam, and I'm no expert, but this is what my perspective was, it compacts the soil. And so if you drain it too quickly, the soil will slough off and the dam will fail anyway. So it's either going to fail from high water or fail from the overeager firefighters showing up and draining all the water out immediately.
Right.
So that plan, it had to go like a half inch every hour or something. It was ridiculous, the amount of stuff. And then we got that accomplished. The water got drained. They removed the obstruction. Everything seemed good. Well, of course, the beaver came back and it plugged it up again. And so we had another meeting to talk about what we're going to do. And I made mention that we could remove the beaver without his permission permanently, which also didn't go over well.
Yeah, how'd that go? Right.
No, that was not good. So I'm learning that the fire department way of doing things maybe is not the right EM way of doing things. But anyway, so that was a great introduction to EM and working through stuff and learning. And I ended up retiring from Fairfax, which has been a great career. Very happy there. But it was a long commute, and there was an opening for a deputy fire chief for emergency management very near my home. It was about a 15-minute drive from my house, actually, in my home community, and just happened to match up correctly. So that's my current role, and I'm immersed fully in EM now because it's a really interesting split, and this is something we can talk about later as we go through. But it's a fire department that is a combination career volunteer department. It's a couple hundred people working for the career side, several hundred volunteers. But within the fire department, EM is a portion of what we do. So there's a deputy chief for emergency management, and I'm a deputy fire chief, as you would expect in any fire department, doing normal stuff, planning, budgeting, all this stuff. But I'm also the county emergency management coordinator, and I have responsibility as an EOC manager during activations, and I report directly to the county administrator for emergency management. So it's an interesting perspective because I work for the fire chief, but the fire chief is not in the EM chain. So the fire chief sits in the senior policy group during an EOC activation, but is not in the standard EM reporting chain where I would work directly to the county administrator and deputy county administrator in that role. So that's my current full-time position. And then, of course, I'm still on the IMT because, IMT, man, I think you got to love that. So that's kind of how things are going for me right now with my career.
Yeah, that's awesome, Ben.
So you said something a minute ago, a couple minutes ago, and I think I had known you for 5 or 6 years before us ever talking about this. But where you worked in Montana, when I went through the basic EM Academy, I think it was like the second delivery or something like that at EMI. It was in like 2016 or 17, I think. We had, well, I guess I should preface this. Currently, a lot of the times, these basic emergency management academies, which is a FEMA curriculum, are offered in states. So there is no central place where everybody goes anymore, at least consistently. One of the downsides of that is like when I went through it, we had a volcanologist come and talk for like 4 hours about specific hazards. And again, I think I've said this before, volcanologist is the most metal job title ever.
Yeah.
That's just so freaking cool. But so she got to talking about like extinction level events. And Yellowstone is at the middle of an extinction level event. So I mentioned this to Ben, it's probably only like 6 months ago. And we started like this hour-long conversation about the Yellowstone caldera. Because, if you're one of the people who's like sitting at home and saying like, oh, it's, this is all fantasy, we're going to be fine, everything. The Yellowstone caldera, I'm not a volcanologist. I don't have all the stats. But it's basically I think it's considered a dormant volcano. I'm going to toss it to Ben in a minute because he has like this perspective from being right there about what their expectations were regarding emergency management.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what is the plan from Montana's perspective.
Yeah, that's where it gets awesome. So, but for the people who don't know, the volcanoes, the reason they erupt differently. So like Mount St. Helens was like a nuclear bomb. And then you have the ones in Hawaii where you see people walking up to it and you have like the slow lava flows.
Right.
It's because of the silica content of the
lava.
One of the reasons, the major reason, is the silica content of the lava. And it's called pyroclastic density, is like the scale that they use for, the amount of explosion you're going to get. Well, the Yellowstone caldera is a dormant-ish volcano in Yellowstone that basically, in the grand scale of time, it's been dormant for a while. But when you look at like a 10,000 year period, we're due, if that makes sense. So I'm looking at a stat right now. I just Googled it real quick because I did not prepare. I never do. I Googled Yellowstone caldera statistics. So I'm looking at how stuff works. And basically, if this happens, if this thing was to go, The eruption would entail more than dangerous lava flows, would kill 90,000 people immediately, and spread a 10-foot layer of molten ash as far as 1,000 miles away from the park. Rescuers would not be able to get into the location because of ash blocking off all points of entry. And equally frightening is the nuclear winter that many climatologists and volcanologists believe would follow this, where the ash, if you remember in 2010, we had the volcano in Iceland that modified air travel. I mean, it changed the climate for like 6 months. This would be significantly worse than that,
Right.
causing famine due to changing temperatures, crops dying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I was surprised it took me and Ben so long to connect to talk about this. But Ben, do you want to tell them what your plan was in Montana for if this was to have happened?
Yeah, I guess I skipped this part of my work history. So in 2015 or 2013, I've been traveling to Montana back and forth since I worked there on the ranch. We have a lot of great friends, and we love Montana. That's the eventual, retirement home area that we're going to live. But at any rate, so we've been traveling back and forth. And one of the cities that we go to is Livingston, Montana, which is about 50 miles north of Yellowstone's northern border. It was the original entrance to Yellowstone National Park back in the day. So they had a fire chief opening, and just called out to see what the deal was. We thought maybe just something interesting to look at, and ended up going through the process and got hired. And in 2015 and 16, I was the fire chief for the city of Livingston, Montana, which was amazing. We love Montana. Unfortunately, we have twin boys at the time that were 3, and we felt like after a while living in Montana was amazing for us, but we wanted to be back closer with family for the kids, which has been great. They have relationship with their grandparents and stuff that we wouldn't have in Montana. But that was a huge undertaking. And the way that Montana works, the fire chief is strictly fire and EMS if you do EMS in your city, which we did in Livingston, paramedic transport. But Montana has, kind of like Virginia Department of Emergency Management, they have a Montana Department of Emergency Services. So DES each has an emergency manager in each county. So that's the person that's specifically responsible for emergency planning and that kind of stuff. But I was, obviously there's very few people in Montana that are, qualified or trained to work in emergency management at any level. So I was heavily involved. Having lived in Montana and talking about the thunderstorm experience and the wildfire experience and working, I've worked part-time for the Forest Service and been on a Type 1 hotshot crew before I started career firefighting. So I've done a lot of wildland firefighting, and that's what I truly anticipated would be the biggest hazard. So I got to Montana, starting to get it settled in place, and I'm like, let me grab this emergency plan. Let's see what we got going on for the city, figure this stuff out, and open it up. And wildfire was not topic 1. It was not topic 2. I was like, what the heck, man? And so topic 1 literally is volcano, and topic 2 is earthquakes, because volcanoes, especially in Yellowstone, because it's dormant from the point of view of there's no current lava flow, but it's extremely seismic active. And if you look at any kind of graph of Yellowstone, so underneath Yellowstone there's a big upwelling of lava. So there's lava kind of sits at a low level within the crust of the earth, but under Yellowstone there's an area where it comes up towards the top, which is why we have all the geothermal activity in Yellowstone. So you got Old Faithful, and you got the mud pots and boiling water and hot springs and all that stuff. That's all fueled by heat from this upwelling of lava. And then part of that is it causes a lot of constant shifting of the crust. So there are earthquakes, multiple earthquakes, literally every single day in Yellowstone area. Some of those are so small or so isolated that no one even notices. Some of them spread out, and you might feel some of the shaking nearby. Occasionally, that can be something as where West Yellowstone, Montana, or Livingston, or whatever may have some experience with that. The Yellowstone caldera itself, I think, try to go back to, I believe it's like 40 miles or so by 30 miles. I mean, it's a huge area. That this is kind of the active caldera, they would say. So literally that is the biggest threat to Livingston, and part of the reason is that Yellowstone sits, the park itself sits at a plateau that's around, I think, 9,500 feet elevation. And then if you're a Yellowstone TV show fan, they talk about Paradise Valley. So Paradise Valley sits just north of Yellowstone, and it's essentially a big funnel that drains. The mountain ranges come down and come to a point, and it drains from that 4,500 feet mark down to around 5,000, 4,500 feet, which is where Livingston sits. So Paradise Valley is about 50 miles long. It's ringed by mountains on each side. It's a nice flat valley, wide across the middle. And it comes down to a intersecting point of mountains, and there's a small mountain pass there. And so already when winds and stuff in Yellowstone, or the temperature in Yellowstone drops, we get a lot of that high density cold air that just rushes down through Paradise Valley and blows through that mountain pass, which greatly increases the speed. And so Yellowstone sends winds to Livingston. Livingston gets, I think it was 270 days a year they experience winds of 35 miles or higher.
Wow.
It's literally one of the windiest places in the world. It was unbelievable. And so if that were to occur, if an actual eruption were to occur, that's exactly the path of what you would see is whatever products from that combustion come out of whatever eruption are going to channel right down through Paradise Valley. They're going to blast out through that pass in the mountains and devastate Livingston, through it. So it's one of the things that they, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at something where there's an immediate 90,000 fatality rate, it's much more than just Livingston. But it's a huge issue, and it's something that I had not in any way anticipated as fire chief, having to worry about. What is a volcano? What does it do? What's the potential? Do I need to pay attention to this? Like, am I supposed to be learning like what might lead us to think that an eruption is coming close? Because I can't remember the time frame, but it is, as Ian was saying, there's a specific time frame. If you look over history, kind of Yellowstone has erupted in this 100,000 years or whatever kind of frequency, and we're overdue for that, according to that history. So definitely it's a huge issue. And then the earthquakes from it. So those were the two major issues. And as a fire chief, I knew zero about volcanoes, and only knew that it knocks down buildings for earthquakes and not really a whole lot more. So it was a crash course in trying to learn.
Yeah,
the bright side of that is that if it was to happen, everything would be vaporized, and you wouldn't have to worry about it.
You wouldn't have to worry about it. Yeah.
I was just reading. According to this site, the last known eruption or major eruption was 640,000 years ago, and the average gap between eruptions is around 725,000 years. However, there is no schedule.
Right.
You know what I mean? They don't follow a schedule. So,
Right.
And
it can happen at any time.
Yeah, and the more that just over the past 20 some years, like the more I kind of poke at like certain things and like these survival scenarios, there's these things everywhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's just like if we had a couple of something at once, that's it. It's over. You know? So.
Yeah, I think in Yellowstone, like if that thing erupted, I want to say, I watched actually a movie last weekend, an old movie called 2012. If you remember that, I think it had John Cusack in it. And in that movie, the Yellowstone caldera erupts.
Really?
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And like DC gets ash from it. Like that's how far the ash falls from that area. Like DC would be covered in something like 8 or 9 inches of ash, which is wild to think about from Montana. But
yes.
The scale of that thing is insane.
Yeah, so I could talk about this all day, but we do have some other questions we wanted to.
We do, yeah.
This was kind of my derail when we were putting together the questions for Ben last night. I was like, I'm going to bring up Yellowstone caldera.
Yeah. It makes sense now. I saw it in the notes. I was like, what is this? And I was like, okay, now it makes sense.
Well, when I was talking to Ben and we were talking, and I was like, so what was the plan? Just, basically kiss your ass goodbye,
right.
if this happens. And it's like, kind of, yeah. I mean, it's, there's not a whole lot you can do at that distance. It's what's going to happen is going to happen. So I was going to ask you. You had mentioned your unfortunate experience working for emergency preparedness, and then the idea, that you went into another agency and started kind of headfirst into emergency management. Yeah. So I guess does your experience match what you expected when you stepped into that, or has it been drastically different and there were kind of things that popped up that you just had no idea about until they hit you?
No, it's been drastically different, and so. A couple things right away. So Virginia just went through this huge wildfire experience. I was heavily involved in that, and we are now in the middle of trying to circle back and look at the declaration process, emergency declaration. We did not declare one in our county, but all around us there are emergency declarations. And so now we had responses to West Virginia, we had responses to other mutual aid, statewide mutual aid, and trying to understand the reimbursement processes for that, because it's on my shoulders to make sure we're meeting that correctly, but I have zero experience with reimbursement. So even from, Fairfax's emergency preparedness, I was still embedded within the fire department. And so we would handle things, but we were like, the EM people will worry about the reimbursement. Well, now I am the EM people. And
Right.
so I sat through a webinar yesterday for an hour, listening to a person from Virginia Department of Emergency Management talk about this process. And I came away with far more questions than I have, and trying to understand how do we document it, how we submit it. So that's been one part. And then kind of the other part is realizing where the gaps are that I didn't think about before. So in the fire department world, we don't really think about, I think, from the point of view of some of the struggles that are in the background. So we just order, like we did evacuations. So one of the things that we're talking about, and I got into, the person that was in my position previously was excellent in many ways, but was not a person who wrote things down. And so we're trying to now track back, and if we ask anyone, hey, what's the plan for this? Like, oh, he knew it, and it's like, yeah, but he didn't write it down, so I don't know it, and I don't have any way to learn it, so we have to redo this. But what I'm kind of understanding is that what looked like, hey, if I just call for a shelter and a shelter gets established, someone's going to come and do that. Well, now I have to figure out, like, who is going to do that, and where are we getting things. So we're looking at a sheltering site for our county where we're going to have around 1,200 people in a shelter. So the shelter, the location's fine. They're like, hey, no worries, we got you. We're ready. Okay. So where are we getting the cots from? Well, there's one source of cots that's shared between like 5 different jurisdictions. So what if we have to all shelter people at the same time? Well, whoever asks for that source of cots first, that's a trailer, they're going to get the trailer, and then everybody else is going to have to be like, I don't know where you're getting cots from, bro, because the only cots that are available are gone. And so, there's a concession stand, or like a concession stand, like a little food area within the venue for this 1,200 person shelter, but there's no commercial cooking operation. So where are we getting food from? And so the person I was asking from this, they're like, well, we'll try to get one of the local restaurants to feed us. I'm like, okay, well, if we're sheltering 1,200 people, what if we don't have a restaurant? Like, what's the plan for that? And they're like, can you figure it out? It's like, okay.
Right.
So I guess that's me. So
Ben's gonna be
that's
good.
yeah. So I think that's, as a fire department person coming in, I think that's the hard part of understanding EM, because my plan had always been, I'm going to ask someone for that. And so, even at Fairfax, so before I went into EM at Fairfax, I was what they call a uniformed fire officer, which you're the kind of a department liaison in our dispatch center. And so you're sort of the liaison between the field and in any other resource that are needed. So it's almost like a EOC kind of like function, I guess, to a degree, because, if we needed someone from OEM, we called OEM. If we needed someone from PD, you worked on that, whatever. So you can kind of coordinate a lot of stuff for the field. And even then, I always just called someone. So if I needed to shelter, like we closed an apartment building, there's a fire and we needed shelter of 50 people, I called OEM and OEM figured it out, and now I am the OEM and I have to be the one to figure it out. So that's been a huge thing. And then Ian and I had this long conversation where I'm realizing even more the difference. So we had a pretty significant wildfire that broke out nearby. It was not in our county, but it was threatening our county significantly. One of the fire lines ended up being a creek that's the dividing line between our county and where the fire occurred. And they asked for help. They needed help with command. And so I jumped in my buggy and the chief's vehicle and drove out there and took command, and it was awesome. And I had did all the command stuff that you would ever want to do as a chief, And
The firefighter came out and you.
Oh yeah, of course. And so then we're talking about, like, thankfully we have a person who is able to work and do. She's trained on EM stuff. She works she's a lieutenant in the fire department, but is on a long-term assignment in a staff position, thankfully, and knows EM. And so I was able to get her and to be able to kind of serve as our EOC rep, which was very helpful. But as the emergency management coordinator, I jumped in my fire truck and drove into somebody else's county during a time of severe crisis and took command of a fire and was committed until 4 a.m. the next day. And there was no one physically sitting in our EOC to manage that. Now, obviously we got someone in place and we were able to make it work, but that was not my first thought. And I think that's a big transition for me. That's the drastic difference is, you can't just jump in your fire truck and speed off and do that. There's other considerations that you have to make, and that's a hard transition to come across.
Yeah. I'm grinning the whole time you're talking because I feel like, and probably anybody that's been in the field of emergency management for any kind of time has been through a lot of the same things you just talked about, like trying to figure out, a sheltering component of their plan, or like realizing like this may not be as well thought out as we thought it was, and there's things that there's these huge gaps that we didn't ever plan for, or oh yeah, by the way, like you want all these cots, and that those cot resources are shared through like 7 jurisdictions, and they're already gone, like they've already taken them. I mean, I've run into that firsthand in the past, and so, but also getting sucked into an incident. I know Ian and I have been through that where you go down to be like a liaison at the Unified Command or a field observer for your EOC, and then the next thing you know, you're working in Unified Command, and now you're not an asset to the EOC anymore. Like you just got sucked into the event. So, it's heartwarming, I guess, to see the evolution of somebody going through the same things that we probably have all been through going into the career. I think it really speaks to the need to really just get experience, like get into the field and actually work through events and see these problems kind of firsthand. You can't really teach all that up front.
Yeah, it fascinates me, not specifically to Ben's story, but more to what Paul was saying, is that there's a lot of people who enter emergency management very young, maybe fresh out of college, etc. It's kind of like the career path they chose, and trying to explain to them what is and isn't something to get excited about. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a big deal. Just chill out, take a breath,
Right.
because those are the people between fire, police, and emergency management. If they get excited, you're in big trouble. So it's just another thing. It's just another day at the office, and that isn't always immediately obvious, I'll say, to people. It's something, and what I was telling Ben, can you believe Ben put me down as his mentor for his EM Academy calls? So, we talk about some of this stuff a lot, but when he brought up the fires, I was like, so who was working in the EOC? And he was like, oh,
Right.
just kind of saying, like, if, and this is what I said, and I know that we've talked about this, me and Paul, before, is like the best way to learn things is when it doesn't make you look bad. You know what I mean? Like, I went through the after action. I'm in my head, and I can say, this is what I should have done differently,
Right.
or what maybe I could have done differently, or ideally I would have done differently. But ultimately, it comes down to, not learning the hard way.
Yeah.
You learn, but there was no, nothing materialized that actually was a negative impact from it. So yeah, it's I find that fascinating.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Oh,
Go ahead,
good.
Paul.
Good. I was gonna say it's interesting too. Like I think your perspective of being in this department as a deputy fire chief, that's responsible for EM, but you have this direct report to the county administrator or county executive, and so like coming from Fairfax County where it's very large jurisdiction, there's a lot of resources in place. You have a fully dedicated department for emergency management. You have emergency management built into the fire department too. Like you have a lot of stuff going on there to switch into this very kind of, you're the guy, like you're it for the smaller county. People I think often take for granted maybe entering the field that most of the country is in that boat, right? Like a lot of jurisdictions are more likely to be a single person resource in the fire department or a part-timer or a volunteer that's doing emergency management work. And when you think about when what that is, like that's a lot, right? So it kind of puts into perspective the field and really what you can accomplish within a lot of these jurisdictions in the country that are much smaller and don't have the resources that some of these big metropolitan areas do have.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge issue, and all around us, every jurisdiction around us, the EM is basically the emergency management coordinator is the fire chief. And they're also, all of our jurisdictions that are around us are primarily volunteer departments with career staff, embedded in the volunteer department running their apparatus and stuff. So the career chief already is busy, and there's a limited amount of resources, and you just get to a place where there's so much going on. It's very difficult to focus on EM, even in my position. So the department I work at is is a little bit larger than most in our region, and we have multiple different deputy chief level people to be able to work on stuff. So I'm the deputy chief of emergency management, but I also handle strategic planning. So I have a whole list of things I'm working on from the fire department side on strategic planning, like working with dispatch and working through budgeting issues and apparatus replacement and station repairs. And we're going to be, excuse me, sorry, we're going to be building a new station. So trying to plan for that and work on through all these issues. That's the fire department side. And then I have a whole list of stuff on EM, so sheltering, EOC upgrades. We're working with the Aries amateur radio stuff. We need to get some of that replaced. Antennas coming up to be replaced. We got search and rescue, crisis track. We got a ton of stuff happening. So both sides have equally large, complicated lists of things, and I'm only one person. And so it's very difficult to work through both of that. So I think sometimes that probably EM gets shuffled off to the side a little bit because it's not as urgent and in your face, until something happens, obviously. But that's kind of where a lot of the jurisdictions are at. So working in Fairfax was a huge benefit to be able to, just like in the emergency preparedness section, I kind of got my toe in the water, so to speak, but I really wasn't like on the hook for everything. And so I think that was a good introduction to help me kind of start changing mindset. Obviously, I still have a lot of mindset to change, but I'm not going to race 30 years of fire department career to like be this sole EM person easily. But so it's a transition.
Excuse me. So the next question was, because we've talked about this in the past, again, about kind of public safety and even fresh out of college people moving into the emergency management field. Are there any skills that when you started your current job that you were specifically thankful that you had that has helped you over the past 6 months to a year as you get transitioning to that new job? What skills helped you that other people may be able to work on?
Yeah, so a couple things I think that were immediately beneficial. So when I was in the fire marshal's office in Fairfax, as I mentioned, I did the explosives job. So the explosives position, there's only so many people that are fire marshals who handle blasting and explosives. And so we got together on a regular basis. So I worked very closely with people from, Loudoun County, Prince William County, other jurisdictions, and we would come together and have a monthly meeting where we got involved. We would bring in representatives from the blasting industry to understand like how's technology changing, what are the new things. So that was huge because I started to learn how to work with people from other jurisdictions. And I started to see some of where we, from the fire department perspective or from the government perspective, could interface with industry and industry groups. And so I didn't realize it at the time. Like that didn't seem to be any of this stuff. I was just trying to figure out like, hey, what's the new thing coming up with blasting? But it really was a huge benefit to me there. And then working through some of the I guess the dispatch center part of it and kind of understanding, how do we go to ask for resources. So in dispatch, probably 2 years ago or so, right, not long before I left the dispatch role, the liaison role in dispatch, we had an event where there was a person who was threatening to jump from a high height. And so the fire department says, hey, we want to get one of the huge inflatable pillows and put underneath, because the person they had no room to move. If they were going to fall, they was going to be right in this specific spot. They're like, let's get a pillow and put it in there. So no problem. I'll get us a pillow. So the fire department used to have one. So I called into our academy where it used to be stored. I'm like, hey, I need the inflatable, pillow. And they're like, yeah, I think it's, I don't think we have any more. It's at the warehouse. So I call the warehouse. I'm like, hey, we got this inflatable pillow. They're like, yeah, I think we surveyed that out and got rid of it. Let me go check the shelf. So they go check the shelf. In the meantime, the call's going on. They're waiting. People are calling, hey, have you heard about the pillow yet? What's going on? So then the guy comes back. He's like, no, we don't have one, but I think Loudoun has one. So I called Loudoun's fire marshal or Loudoun's dispatch center and say, hey, can I get the pillow? And they're like, yeah, let's check. And then 10 minutes later, they call back, no, we don't have one anymore, but I think Montgomery has one. So I call Montgomery and they're like, no, I don't think we have one. So finally we're like, hey, you know what? DC has one. We're sure that there's a specific agency in DC that has this pillow. I'm like, no problem. So I call that agency. I'm like, hey, I need this pillow. They're like, yeah, okay, we have one for people at 100 feet of height or people at 200 feet of height. Like, what do you need? So I'm like, okay, let me call back to the incident scene. How high is this thing? So I get the information. I'm like, okay, I need I think it was the 100-foot pillow. I'm like, we're good with the pillow. I'm like, okay, yeah. So who's paying for this? Because, we have to charge overtime for this, and it's going to be somebody's got to drive it, and we need the fuel, and we need the time. I was like, what? So now I'm trying to figure out, like, are we going to pay for this or not? So, and we go through this whole thing. Literally, it's like an hour plus of me trying to make dozens of phone calls, work all this out, and the fire department's like, yeah, we're not paying for that. Forget it. So then we don't even use the pillow at all. And I'm like, okay, that's like the most EM thing I think I probably ever had done that I know of. So stuff like that really is like, if you think about it in context, like that was a very small thing, but it helps to understand like some of the difficulties when we were going through the wildfires of trying to call around and figure out like where are we getting mutual aid from, who's coming. Then someone, hey, I'm not coming unless we're getting paid. We need to work out this agreement first. And it's difficult, man. And it's like so those things really kind of help lay the groundwork, I guess. And so now when I'm dealing with stuff, I at least have some level of experience to push back on. But it's not easy to make that jump, I think.
Yeah, I think in my opinion, from what you described, I think the EM equivalent that I'm most familiar with is the scope creep on any project or plan. Where you end up chasing your tail for I don't know how long. Like, I'm going to try hard not to throw anybody under the bus, but I've had multiple projects in the past where I have a boss who asks for something. I get to working on it, spend a lot of time doing it. Then I get a new boss 6 months later. They have a different vision. Then I get a new boss 6 months later. They have a different vision, and so it ends up something that just never gets done. So I just stopped talking about it. It's like, you know what? I've spent literally 6 months of work time over the past 13 years trying to get this thing off the ground. And I've now realized that it's not going to happen. So I'm just never going to bring it up again, but it's the chasing of the tails. And I know me and Paul have done some of the project management stuff that does the same thing. Where
Yeah. Remember the concept of like leader's intent, like making sure you understand, like have them write down what do you actually want, so I can say like go back and say like this is what you said you wanted.
Yeah, And that's part of that was part of the any type of project management, kind of defining the project itself, and then the federal plan development process.
Yeah,
they have a whole process where you basically write formally almost a memo from the leader to yourself and say this is what you're asking for, correct? And they can always change it. They're the boss. They can always change it.
Right.
The issue is that they don't remember what they asked for, or they want to change it like completely reverse direction and go in a completely different direction after momentum's already there. But that's what I was thinking about while you were talking, and some of my experiences where I just wanted to beat my head against a brick wall because of that type of thing.
Yeah, and it's there's nothing in the fire department that really prepares you. And so one of the things I was thinking about was thinking about how this might go or whatever was I've recently started teaching for the National Fire Academy. And so I'm teaching fire department, command and control fire department operations at natural and man-made disasters. And it's an excellent class, and it's kind of the end of a series. So there's a command and control series you can take, and it starts out of like command and control of incident operations, kind of like the Type 5, maybe Type 4, and then you go into command and control of multi-alarms, so like second and third alarm, kind of larger scale, maybe closer to Type 3, and then target hazards, same thing, kind of Type 3, but specifically for like chemicals or whatever. And then this is kind of the culminating class. And so this is a 2-week class, and over the course of the class, you write multiple IEPs going through scenarios. But one of the last days of class, they take students and simulate them working in an EOC. And it's the only fire department class I know where people work in an EOC. And the one thing, so I've taught one session so far, so I'm a very new instructor in this. But the one thing I heard from students constantly was they don't understand what is the EOC doing. Like, why? Like, who? If they want the fire truck, like if they're on scene in command of this, so that of course it's Central City, and you have the whole 1,600-page Central City ESSD and all the stuff to look at, and over the course of 2 weeks you're using all that, like you're creating shelters, you're doing all this stuff, and it's a huge hurricane scenario that you're working through, and they're like, we don't understand what does the EOC do, and so then you're trying to explain to people who are assigned roles in an EOC, like what is it that the EOC is trying to accomplish. So if they need mutual aid, who are they going to? Where are they getting mutual aid from? And it's a little bit difficult because you got students from all over the country, but it's just such an abstract concept for the fire department people because we're already in command. Like, why would I go to another command is kind of how they see it to a degree. And so I think that's really difficult to bridge that gap. And so that was one thing I spent a lot of time talking about in class was like, what is an EOC? Why do we have it? What are they supposed to do? And how does it support the fire department command chain? And, it's not an easy concept to work through.
Yeah, I think it's funny. A lot of my interaction, I'm kind of, I have things I maintain from the fire department perspective, and then I manage the incident management team. But Um, it's I'm gonna come back to that. I gotta be careful how I phrase it. So I'm gonna come back to that. So for now, I'm just gonna move on to the next question. I don't want to get myself in
Oh
trouble.
man.
Um, so are there any skills that you wish you had more of when you made the transition? Like something where you're like, man, I wish I was better at this. That would really help.
Yeah, I think right away, having a better understanding of the FEMA side of stuff. So, like, we talk a lot about community lifelines. Well, I don't really know a lot about a bunch of the community lifelines. So, I know about general stuff. But, like, when you start really diving down into roads and how does that work in transportation and what are we doing with public health? Where are they tied into this? So one of the things that in my current role, I get a weekly summary from the EM for Virginia Department of Health in our region, which is great. But there is a lot going on with public health, and they're talking about like putting together specific IMTs devoted to outbreak of this or that. There's tons of stuff happening. There's vaccination stuff going on. So there's a whole world of emergency management tied into public health that I had zero visibility on until I started getting this email. And now, it doesn't really affect me in my day-to-day job. I don't see it even currently in the EM role. I don't see it other than that email, but it's going on in our community all the time. And the potential for us to be involved in that at any 1 second is huge. So like yesterday, I went to a meeting where we brought together transportation officials from Virginia and West Virginia, because West Virginia is going to have a road construction project that's tied in that on a major road into our region that they're going to close the road for 2 days so they can dig up this huge pipeline that goes through there and replace it. So not a huge thing, but we're bringing stuff together and we're talking about it and all this stuff. And the guy's like, "Yeah, this is so much better than the railroad." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, what's up with the railroad?" He's like, "Yeah, they have they have a railroad that goes across this same road in a different location." And he told me that the railroad owns the right of way, and the state road goes across the railroad's right of way. So when they want to close the state road, they just close it with no notice because they're doing whatever work on it. And so we were talking about how that impacts and stuff. And I'm like, "Well, so what's the deal with the railroad?" Like, he's like, "Yeah, the railroad has a specific right of way." So, I would have never worried about in the world railroads or right of way issues or any of that stuff in the fire department frame of mind. And so, so the skills, I think, like the physical knowledge base is probably the biggest, just understanding that there's so much more out there and you have to be open to where that might take you and what you need to dig into. But skill wise, I think the biggest thing is just making sure that for me, like the reimbursement process, understanding how and when to open the EOC and how to involve people in it. That's kind of one of the hardest things. So our EOC hasn't been actively utilized more than once or twice over the past 10 or 15 years. And even then it was, not fully realized. And so most of the people are not trained. Most of the people have no experience in working in the EOC. And so I'm going to need to really dig deep into collaboration and motivation and working through people, influencing change in the EOC, getting people to buy into participating. So one of the things that we're working with is we have the sheltering that we talked about earlier. So our social services is the lead for sheltering in our jurisdiction for that ESF. And so working through them, they have no one in their department's ever done sheltering before, ever. And so they don't have any training for sheltering. They know they're supposed to do it, or they're supposed to lead it, but they didn't understand that there's actually training classes they need to take for it. They didn't have any of that information. They didn't know what to do with it. So,
Right.
trying to get them, and now I'm trying to encourage a department director that I have no significant authority over in any way to take time out of their daily work schedule, which is already slammed, to send people to go to FEMA classes to learn how to do sheltering. And so that's a tough push to get people to buy into that kind of stuff. And so I think, just from my experience, I primarily worked with other fire departments or police departments, or even to a degree with EM people who at least are bought into the emergency world. But when you start trying to work with people who aren't in that emergency world, this is just another task, right? Like to them, it's like, yeah, it's emergency. Okay, I appreciate that, but I've also got to get paperwork done. We've got clients to support. We got things happening and whatever, and so you're just another task that needs to get completed essentially. And so that, I think, from one of the hardest things for me has always been to accept that the fire department just isn't as big as the deal as what we think it is. because we think it's a huge deal in our mind. And then when you're sitting at the table with all these other places, you're just one of all those other places.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point. The need to try to involve those agencies that have no typically in their day to day no real like emergency response role, and kind of convince them. Like, remember, Ian and I've been through this a ton with Public Works in the past, and trying to convince them like, no, when this bad thing happens, like you have a huge role here from a Public Works perspective, and we really need you here at the table, and we need your resources, and we need all these things from you, and convincing them like, but it's after 4:30. Like, what do you mean? It's on a Saturday. Like, I don't understand. Like, we don't work those days. There's it's like the people bridge that the EM role has to become is critical in a lot of those areas. And
Yeah, to your point, Paul, and I think this may speak to some of it. I mean, we had a situation, I don't even know when it was resolved, 8 years ago, I think, where we had an area of the county I work in that flooded at the time pretty frequently, and Public Works was the first person on scene. They were watching the river gauge, watching as the water came up, and literally serving as a field observer to report back what the conditions are. We put a process in place that, once they got there, they were supposed to call the 911 center, let them know they were there, and then police and fire would go out and maybe not always stay with them, but check on them, make sure they don't need anything, etc., and just kind of prepare to come back if it's going to flood. But we literally, basically, when the emergency operations plan was updated, we had to put in Public Works could take command. Because when they get there, they're in charge. They've got a group of people down there. They're actually the command element there, and then function in unified command with police and fire later on. And you would have thought we were asking them to do surgery on a failing patient,
Seriously.
Whatever. I mean, they were just like, well, I'm not qualified to do that.
can't happen, right? It can't do it.
Yeah,
You can't do that.
And so my question is always like, well, have you met some of these folks who do it? You know what I mean? Like, this is not that big a deal, like it's just like kind of the overthinking, where eventually they got there, and then that particular hazard theoretically got mitigated, so it hasn't really come up again. But it's that hesitancy, I think, that was a knowledge thing, I think. But then you talk about the day jobs, et cetera, which, it kind of leads back to what I was trying to be careful about how I said it earlier. When these things happen, as you were talking earlier, Ben, I didn't say anything, but we take for granted that when we talk, we understand each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, like, when I noticed earlier, you were like type 5, type 4, type 3, blah, 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 IAPs, and I'm like,
Yep.
Probably most of the people watching this know exactly what you mean, but I'm sitting here, like, it reminded me that I've had calls in the past year, face-to-face conversations or phone calls, where I've had people who should probably know the answers to the questions they're asking me. I'll be talking, and they'll go, stop. What does SMA mean? Or stop.
Right.
What's a Rec A? You know what I mean? And so, like, they'll literally stop me and ask, and it's like, I feel like I don't know your stuff, so I'm not going to criticize you, but I feel like we've talked about this before. But when you were talking earlier, it just reminded me about how much we take for granted, people who kind of live in this little bubble, about we have our own language, our own acronyms, our own culture, basically, that people from outside, it's probably very intimidating to. It'd be like us sitting home watching ER or something where they're doing all this medical talk, and we're just like, I don't understand
What's
what
all
you're
this?
saying.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And if you don't know, if you are listening to this episode and you heard all those acronyms, and I intentionally didn't stop Ben to say hey, this is what this means. Whatever. we have 5 other episodes prior to this one that talk about 99% of all those acronyms in pretty good depth. So go back and listen if this is the first one you've heard, because they're definitely explained a number of different times in our other episodes.
And it was so long ago that my beard wasn't as gray, so you can go check that out too.
That's very true. Yeah, that's very true.
So I guess the last question, Ben, and then we can just BS wrap it up. We all know people who are in either police, law enforcement, fire, EMS, who have outwardly expressed they want to do emergency management when they retire. Like when they leave their current job, they want to do emergency management. Me and Paul have kind of joked about that before. I was wondering, Ben, as somebody who kind of did that, what would you say to them? About what would be a piece of advice? What would you say if you could reach them all at once and just give them one thing? What would it be? One word of wisdom.
It's not as easy as it looks, and I think that the biggest thing is not thinking you're going to. So I jokingly said, so I retired from Fairfax on a Friday. And then I say I was a gentleman of leisure for 2 days, and then I started this job. So that's kind of how it worked for me. But this is not a retirement role, so it's not like you're going to come into this position and suddenly you're just going to lay back and it's going to be easy. So one of the things that I constantly work more than I'm a salaried employee. I'm over my 40 hours every week, and there's phone calls at night. There's phone calls on the weekends. Things happen. Today is a high fire danger day in my area. Well, this is a Saturday, and I'm supposed to be off, and it was supposed to be raining this morning. Well, the rain didn't happen, and it's going to be bright and sunny and windy all day. So, things just occur. And it was funny because this question really is interesting. I went with Ian to a EM conference before I retired from Fairfax. And we were sitting down there, and we're like, okay, there's the EM from that county. He's retired from the fire department. There's the EM from that county. He retired from the fire. Everybody there's stressed out. They're all trying to figure out what to do. They all got 1,000 things on their plate. So we all thought we were going to be like these retired guys that are just going to like go into our second career. And now you can like step back. And one of the people I worked with at a recent conference was telling me, he's like, yeah, I retired and I took this job. And he was in a different role, not in emergency management. And he's like, it's so nice to know that I'm just relaxed now. I don't have to worry about things. I'm like, I think I like increased my stress by like 1,000% because now, in this role, you're not retired to the point where you can just come in and work that, leave it at 4:30 like we were talking about. This is a 24/7 job, and there's always a responsibility to make sure if I'm going to be gone. Like I know I'm thinking about traveling overseas with the family in a couple months, so I'm already starting to make plans. Okay, if I'm going to be gone for a couple weeks, how are we going to make sure that the authority's covered? Who am I making sure that's in line to cover the EOC? And as a retired person, I don't think you really anticipate that those are going to be the requirements of a job. And so something to think about for anyone who's thinking that, hey, I'm going to retire from the police department and go take this job and just chill on EM. It's like maybe if you're going into a huge EM, like Fairfax is where there's 20, 30 people doing EM and you're in one role, you might not have that level. But if you're coming into a jurisdiction where you're one or two people, that falls solely on your shoulders and all of it is your responsibility. And so you're not going to be able to be in that kind of that space.
Right. Yeah. I think that's good feedback. It kind of reminds me, and I don't know if we may have talked about this on a previous episode. If not, we should do it again in the future. But it's kind of like the winning friends and influencing people. The circle. I always defer back. 20, I can't remember. 15 years ago, I had a boss and he had an underling who were the biggest assholes on the planet. And they had no idea what they were doing, but were very, very much interested in making sure I didn't have a say in any of the things I was doing. And so, it basically put me into the hospital. Like I was so convinced that I could change their minds if I just communicated it correctly. Like it was my fault. And so I took a class shortly after that where it talked about the circle of control, circle of influence, and circle of concern. Yeah. And so, it's kind of the concentric circles where the smallest circle is the circle of control, the things that you have an immediate impact on, the things you can make decisions to carry those out. Outside of that is the circle of influence where, my friend Ben is doing something I don't like. So I can try to have a conversation with him and see if I can change his mind. That would fall within influence. And outside of that, you have concern, where you can't do anything. You have no impact on it, no influence, but whatever happens is going to impact you, right? And so one of the things that's interesting about emergency management is you don't have any control over anything. You truly don't. I mean, because everything that you rely on lives in someone else's shop. Yeah. So they may have agreed to do something. They may have said, we've got this. They may have said, we got supplies. This is how this is going to work. But when it happens, you have no control over that. Yeah. Because, it's not like you can, send the police to pick them up and drag them down to open a shelter, Right. And I'm not saying that would ever come up with anything we've talked about, but it's just an example where, to me, it's extraordinarily stressful. And the other part of it is that so much of this is built on relationships. Yeah. And who likes you, not even likes you, who thinks that you can help them? Who thinks they can use you would be a better way to say it. Because I'm not under any illusion people like me. But but there are people who I think would look at me as like a useful tool in some instances, and I mean that in multiple ways. In some instances, they'd say, okay, I don't like him, but he can be useful to me here. So over the course of 20 years, trying to develop those relationships and now have everybody's cell phone number, texting periodically over the course of the year, it never stops. it never ever stops. So like this is the tip of the iceberg, man. Is I guess what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is that the longer you're in that spot or the longer you're doing EM, the more you'll get. Like yesterday, we have a 3-year-old. You know what I mean? And he I can't remember exactly what happened. He either kept us late or woke us up early, and so I got up real early. So I went out and did some yard work, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to take a nap. Well, 3 different sets of text messages later, not happening, right?
Yeah.
And that's every single day.
Yep.
But yeah, so just kind of throwing, it's part of me venting and just kind of throwing it out there is comparing it to what you're talking about.
Yeah,
it gets
yeah.
worse and worse the longer you're in the industry.
It's hard to keep up with it. I would say, yeah. It's and we did talk about this a little bit in another episode, but burnout is a real thing, and we see a lot of people that come into the field of emergency management, whether they're straight out of college or young and gung ho, or in your situation where you've had a career and you're very experienced in that career, then you retire and you go into this role as a second career. Either way you come into it, most people come into it and they want to affect change and they want to do great things, and that's good. But if you don't take into account what Ian was referencing about your kind of like circle of influence and what you can control or not, you will stress yourself out to the point where you will burn out, or you will have a health problem of some kind. I can guarantee it. Both of us have had that event occur from stress from the job, and it's a lot about trying to create some sort of balance, even when it's hard to in your role, especially when you're kind of a single resource. Makes it even harder to kind of balance that responsibility.
Yeah, it's interesting. For Ben, because you have, I think, one person who really is dedicated to kind of assist you.
Yeah.
One of the things I've said in my head before, not out loud, but the cavalry's not coming. You have to go find your own.
Yeah.
Like the help is never, like, you're not all of a sudden going to have 15 people to assist you. So what you do on a day-to-day basis to develop those other 15 people who are willing to means that when something happens, you have somebody to lean on instead of everything falling on you.
Well, and one of the things that when I've had a lot of learning experiences in my life, of course, but when I went from the fire station, I was into the dispatch liaison role. One of the things I quickly learned about dispatchers was that it's an incredibly difficult job because it's high stress all the time. You're getting a phone call 1 minute that's basically someone complaining about their neighbor's dog barking or something like that. The next minute, someone's screaming because they're trapped in a fire or car crash or being assaulted or whatever. So it's just unbelievable. But they don't get good closure. So you have this phone call, you answer the phone, someone's screaming, they're in the worst thing of their life, oh my God, you take all the information, you get it in your computer, you send it over to be dispatched, and then you hang up. And you have no idea like what happened. You're just coordinating. You're not doing things most of the time. I mean, sometimes there's pre-arrival instructions and things like that where you deliver a baby or give CPR, but a lot of times you're just taking information and passing it on to the people who are going to go do stuff. And I thought at the time, like, this is so incredibly hard. And so one of the things I worked very diligently on as a liaison was to try to get feedback from the crews in the field to the dispatchers about, hey, your call made a difference. Like, this information was important, this person survived, or whatever, the closure. And it's kind of similar to a degree, and I see that in what we do with the EOC to a certain degree, because I'm not physically doing things to manage anything. Like, I'm not going out, I shouldn't be going out. I do because, I'm still a firefighter, but I shouldn't be going out to do things. I should be bringing in information from command, coordinating that, getting it out to the other, whoever else we need to go do things to help them. And you're kind of coordinating all this stuff. And so as someone who comes from, a fire department or a police department, it's very difficult to now be in a position where I'm not supposed to go do that stuff. I'm supposed to coordinate all of it. I'm coordinating other people doing those things, and that's a really difficult spot to be in. Coming from the IMT world, I think that was very helpful. So just a quick throwback to that, kind of like I went to my first large wildfire as an IMT person. And we went to Montana, I think it was like 2017, 2018. We're on a huge complex fire. We had fires that were 40 some miles apart that we're managing, and one that was way up in the mountains, 10,000 feet, and all this mess. So we set up the command post. I was on that assignment for 8 days. I never saw smoke. In 8 days, I never saw smoke from the fire. Nothing. We had 1,000 people on these fires. Never saw smoke. So I was just at this wildfire last week, and the initial command post was kind of being overrun by fire. The fire was spreading rapidly. We had to back out and I said, listen, if we're going to move this initial command post, I kind of came in later, said, let's set this up for a Type 3 incident. Let's go somewhere where we can support it. We have bathrooms, we have lights, we have good road access. So we went several miles from the incident. Where we were at, we couldn't see the smoke from our fire. And I was fine with that because I'm used to that now to a degree. But the other people were very upset by that. And so they kept leaving and going up to the top of a hill that was nearby to look and see what the smoke looked like, and then would come back to the command post. And so it's really hard. Like, now I'm coordinating what those crews are doing in the field, even from the command, even as an incident command perspective, we're coordinating what the crews are doing. So I don't need to necessarily see the fire or be part of it. I need to hear what they're saying and make those decisions. But it's a very hard transition for the other commanders who are so used to being physically parked in front of a burning house that on this large scale incident where they couldn't physically see the things happening, they were very uncomfortable with that to a degree. So just one of those things where it's you have to come to terms with the fact that you're no longer doing things and that you're coordinating other people who get to go do those things.
Yep. Spot on.
Yeah, your time of having fun is over.
Yeah,
that's right.
Watch other people have fun. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, that was all the questions we had. Ben, do you have any other words of wisdom, thoughts, concerns, comments, complaints?
Get on an IMT if you can. I think that's for me for emergency management. It's the closest tie between. I think it's a good go between doing things in the fire department and doing things as an EOC. So you're stepping back. You're still involved in managing an incident, but you're stepping back out of the physically. Like I'm holding a hose line. Now I'm making sure I'm supporting the people who are holding a hose line, but you're still doing stuff tied to an incident, and that kind of gets you kind of one step closer then to stepping even further out to an EOC where now maybe I'm not supporting directly the person that's holding the hose line, but I'm supporting the incident commanders who are supporting the people with the hose line. And so it's, it can be a process, and I think that's either taking classes for IMT stuff or physically being on an IMT. I think it's a good go-between, but it's a great career. I'm excited to be part of it, and I'm very happy with the Surviving Central City podcast. This has been really good, so it's a good chance to talk about stuff, so thanks.
Yeah, Ben, I think, really appreciate you coming on because this is a wealth of information for people that are either in your situation or maybe thinking about transitioning into the field of emergency management. But plus, it's just cool to hear your stories and your experience, and you've had a lot of interesting previous positions and jobs and stuff like that too. So we really appreciate the time coming on.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, I agree with everything Paul said. One of the things that I wanted to make sure everybody was aware of is that the reason it was a year and a half was because of Paul. He's the reason it took a year and a half.
That is bullshit.
Because I think there's been 7 or 8 vacations, a job change.
I'm a busy guy. What can I say? No, I think we both point the finger at each other so constantly. But we are both busy people too. And but we, funny enough, I love doing it. Like we love doing these episodes and getting to talk about this stuff. And we kind of took what we were doing personally and privately and put it out there for others to hear what we talk about, and like what we this is stuff we talk about internally with each other all the time. So everyone else gets the chance to kind of hear our discussions, I guess. But yeah, more to come.
I'm looking forward to the new episodes, man. Who else are you going to get on? What are we going to talk about? It's good stuff.
We're back.
Yeah. We're back. It shouldn't be a year and a half. I know that. So we'll see. It'll be much more often than every year and a half. So, all right. Well, thank you again, Ben, for coming on. Hopefully, everybody anybody who listens or watches is going to find it as entertaining as we can possibly produce. Paul, do you want to do your typical closeout?
Yeah. Real quick, just we do still have a Twitter account at SurvivingCC. You can email us at survivingcentralcity@gmail.com. And for all of my survivors out there, stay classy and keep on surviving.